Hi, this is Dan Korver, pastor here at Dalton Hill Baptist Church. We're a small Baptist church located in Owasso, Oklahoma. We're small enough to know you, but we're big enough to serve you and for you to serve as well. Our vision is to rescue, restore, and return to service. Rescue a non-believer or a believer who has been hurt or is lost, restoring them to Christ in fellowship with other believers with the desire that they in turn will help others along their way.
We starting a new series. We just finished the one on Paul, and kind of like when they did Paul, this one is also a rather ominous one. That's why I've never done it. But we'll be looking at Moses. You think of Moses. How many verses are in the Bible that where Moses is mentioned? You ever?
Probably a lot.
Just under 800. So I think I'll do one verse a message, okay?
Job security.
Job security, there you go. No, but I think what happens is, you think about the Ten Commandments with Charlton Heston, or we think of the Prince of Egypt with Moses' chariot race with Ramses. You think about it. So often people's knowledge or view of people or scripture is based on Hollywood. And Hollywood can have some truth, but then they also put a lot of stuff in there that might have happened, but nobody knows if it did, or just blatantly isn't true. And so you sometimes wonder when you go to them. I saw a movie yesterday just like that. You wonder, okay, it's based on a true story. Okay, how much truth is this, and how much truth has been kind of ad-libbed? But I think in order for us to really understand the background, we have to. I understand Moses. You have to understand the background. You have to understand the historical past and the present circumstances to understand what's going on. And that's part of what happens when we look at things today. We don't really think a lot about what was going on at the time. That's why we're rewriting so much history, sad to say, in our country. For instance, is Robert E. Lee looked on favorably or unfavorably in our country today? Okay. Who was was Abraham Lincoln's first choice to lead the North?
Robert E. Lee.
Robert E. Lee. Why did Robert E. Lee not accept it? What was his reason?
Because he was from Virginia.
He was from Virginia, and he says, I believe in states' rights. And I will support my state whichever way they choose to go, because I believe in states' rights. That goes back, when you think about it, just under 100 years earlier when we had our independence. We didn't, the U.S. did not like Britain doing what? Taxes and telling you everything you could and could not do. And the reaction, so they're looking at the states' rights. Whatever the state, we are not having, how many of us is that going on in our state today? We don't like other ones telling us what we can and cannot do in our state, or whatever it might be. So I think a lot of times when we understand the situation, it will greatly help you when you look at things. So I'd like to open up today just to understanding the historical past and the present circumstances in which Moses lived. So to get it, you'll have to start all the way back in Genesis 15. I know Moses is in Genesis 15 directly. Let's look at it first of all, the historical past. It's the Abrahamic covenant, but it's important when we're given this. Starting in verse 13 of chapter 15. And you'll notice in verse 13 of Genesis 15, we'll look at the God has a plan and nothing surprises him. How many of you would agree with that? In your own life, do you believe that? So let's look at it. God said to Abram, notice his name hadn't changed yet, because he hasn't had children yet. Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they'll be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Okay, so before they ever had children, he had children. Before Israel ever went to Egypt, God already said what? You're going to be enslaved, and you're going to be enslaved how long?
400 years.
Okay. You have the same thing when you look at it in Jeremiah 25. And that's what Daniel was reading in Daniel 9. How long are we going to be in captivity? 70 years. You start looking at it, God has different things. You have the same thing in Judges. If my people will follow me, we'll have this. But if they don't, we'll have oppression. They then would call on God, they have a new deliverer. So you have a lot of things when you look at it. So you notice 14. But I will also judge the nation whom they will serve, and afterwards they'll come out with many possessions. Did they come out with many possessions?
Yes.
Yeah. So you stop and think about it. Notice he then says, and as for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a good old age. Then notice 16. Then in the fourth generation in Genesis was 100 years. So then in the fourth generation they shall return here, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. God's waiting on the Amorites, and they are getting more and more and more wicked. And finally God says what?
I know.
Okay, that's enough. Does God have a plan? Notice also then in verse 17, I think it's important. And it came about when that sun had set, that it was very dark, and behold, there appeared a smoking oven and flaming torch which passed through these pieces. Okay, when they make a covenant in the Old Testament, they would cut animals in half, put one half on one side and one half on the other side, and then what would the two parties do?
Walk between.
They would walk between them, which meant to both parties what? If I break this covenant, this is what you can do. How many people walked in between? There's a covenant between Abraham and God, and who went in between? Only God did. That's why this is an unconditional covenant. God made this promise. You notice also he says from the river, the covenant in 18 is going to go from the river Nile, Egypt, to the great river Euphrates. Has Israel ever had that much land?
No.
No. Some people will say, well, during Solomon they had people paying tribute from that distance. Paying tribute, it doesn't mean it's yours. So obviously this will be a future. During the millennial reign of Christ, they will get this eventually. But when you think about it, God has a plan and nothing surprises him. Did he predict it? What about possessions? Had they rebelled when Moses tried to get them to rebel when he was 40, would they have had possessions? No. It's important. How of us try to jump ahead of God's plan? You ever jumped ahead of God's plan in your life? At least we have one honest person here. You notice also there's going to be a pause. I think it's interesting. It's going to be 400 years later. But God is working. God's working. So I think it's important when you think about the working part and then the promise. God gives us the promise. What about you and I? Psalms 139, 13 to 16. Did God form you in your mother's womb? Are your days numbered? Does God have a plan for you? What about Jeremiah? You think about Jeremiah 1 and verse 5. Remember he makes the statement, behold, before you were born, I appointed you prophet. Do you think God has a plan for you? I think it's important because I think what we think of is God has a plan for the great people. God has a plan for every one of us. You have the same thing in Jeremiah 29:11. You remember he says, I know the plans that I have for you to give you a future and a hope. Now that's not only true of a nation, but it's also true of an individual. When you think about it, when you look at this part just alone, God has a plan and nothing surprises him. The second thing, they'll go over to Genesis 46 on this understanding the historical past. And then obviously we know the story of Joseph well, or most I've assumed that in chapter 46, if you remember, there was a famine, and they then left, and Joseph was there. And notice in verse 31 of chapter 46. And they come down, and he's talking about Joseph and his family come down to him. Notice in verse 31, Joseph said to his brothers and to his father's household, I'll go up and tell Pharaoh and will say to him, my brothers and my father's household who are in the land of Canaan have come to me. The men are shepherds, for they have been keepers of flock. They have been brought their flocks and their herds and all they have. It came about when Pharaoh heard this, he said, what's your occupation? Notice what he says to his servants. This is Joseph speaking. You shall say, we are keeper of livestock. Why did he say you are a keeper of livestock instead of saying we are shepherds? Read the last of 34. Every shepherd is loathsome in Egypt. Egypt, breadbasket of the world at that time, they raised cattle, but they did not care for sheep. Grady, is it true today that most people who have cattle don't care a whole lot for sheep?
Yes.
Yeah, the same thing around. Look at any Western. Did we have any battles in the Westerns between the herdsmen and the shepherds? So Joseph is telling them, hey, when you go there, when you go to Pharaoh, tell him you're a keeper of livestock. Don't say you're shepherds. Now they don't. Then they go in chapter 47. They're asked the question in verse 3. Pharaoh asked the brothers, what's your occupation? And they said to Pharaoh, your servants are shepherds, both we and our fathers. They tell them the truth. And you think about it, it's loathsome. You notice then it goes on, and Pharaoh said, we have come to sojourn. Remember, they're only supposed to be temporary, but according to Genesis, their temporary is going to be how long?
400 years.
400 years. How long have we been a nation? We're only halfway there. Now think about that. How many of us would leave and go back to our homelands, wherever our ancestors came from? For some of us, that'd be about 20 different homelands, but because there's a lot of different. Notice what he says then. What he actually tells them. He says they can go to the land of Goshen. That is the most fertile place in Egypt. What does that say about Pharaoh's view of Joseph? We can't stand shepherds, but because of what you've done for us, our nation, we're letting you take the most prized area there is. So you think about it, does God provide often in unusual ways and through other people? How many of you has God provided an unusual way or, through other people? But God's moving them. And how many of us are realizing God's moving people to help you? So who should be getting the credit? I think about it in my own family, just how did we end up in Oklahoma when we were born in Iowa? And there was a pastor that had something to do with that, correct? We also had needing that father needs work, dad needs work, and have an uncle in Texas and said, hey, there's a lot of jobs down here. Why don't you come down here? And then a job from Texas opens in Oklahoma, and that's how we end up here. God's moving different people and using different people. How'd my uncle leave Montana to come down here? Raise his family here. My parents said, hey, there's jobs here. Comes here and settles here. You stop and think about it. What about with you and I? How of this has God used different circumstances, different people to bring it to pass? And I think it's an interesting question we can ask ourselves. Who's helped you along your journey? Have you been helped along your journey? The third thing I think, notice when you get to chapter 50, it's interesting. So God has a plan. Nothing surprises him. God provides often in unusual ways and through others. And again, how well had his brothers and father prepared for the famine? And how well had Egypt prepared for the famine? They had because of what? Because of Joseph and God working through him. And you notice in God's time they did bow down to him. But it probably wasn't too wise for Joseph to keep bringing it up about twice on how they're going to bow down to him and so on. I think that was something he should have kept to himself. But I think a lot of times we, at that age, probably are, especially when have 10 older brothers, we're probably going to want to say something as well. Look at Genesis chapter 50. Recognizing God has a plan in your life. You'll notice in verse 15, Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead. Notice what they're talking among themselves. What if Joseph should bear a grudge against us and pay us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? Oh, Dad's gone. He can't protect us anymore. Joseph has all this power. And boy, he can nail us. Which he certainly could. But he could have done that all these years before. So notice then they create a lie. Deception was certainly part of their family history. And notice they said, you notice in verse 16 and 17, in 17, they made this statement that Jacob had told the others, but hadn't told Joseph. Please forgive, I beg you, the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of God, your father. And Joseph wept when they spoke it to him. Why? Why would he weep? Okay. Obviously they don't see his heart. Because obviously, if he still was carrying a grudge, he could have done that long before that. But it's interesting, they fall down and basically, we're going to be your servants. Notice, I think it's interesting what he does. By the way, it wasn't a fulfillment of prophecy. But notice, I think it's interesting. 19, Joseph said to them, do not be afraid, for you might in God's place. Whose place is it to judge? It's God's place. Notice what he says, I think 20, is one of the most important verses. And as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, the preservation of many people. Did Joseph have to spend a long time to get there? You think about it, 13 years being sold into slavery, Potiphar's house, in the jail, everything else, for the purpose of preserving the Israel's nation and the people. What would your view be if you were Joseph? How many of you might be a little upset with God? Why did I have to go through all this? Because there's a lot bigger picture than just you and I, what we have. It's interesting when you have, let's keep going on with Joseph. And notice in 24, he gets to see his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Notice in 24, Joseph said to his brothers, I'm about to die, but God will surely take care of you and bring you up from this land to the land which he promised oath to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. Okay, does he believe they're going back?
Yes.
So does he believe Genesis 15? He knows the promise given to Abraham. So notice what he then says. Joseph made the sons of Israel swear, God will surely take care of you, and you shall carry my bones up from here. I don't want to be buried in Egypt, even that's where I spent most of my life. I want to go back to the promised land. Dig up the bones. You think about it, how many years later before they dug them up? If it's 400 years, how many years later before this actually occurred? And how many ancestors do you think are going to remember and do it? Well, that's 350 years later. Who cares? But when I think about it, how many of us are recognizing God's plan that he has in our life? I think it's important. God has a plan. We may not see it at the time. I look at a lot of different things. Meeting Mrs. Ketchum, working for her. That certainly seemed like God did know what he was doing, but obviously he did. Working at UPS, all those different things really made a difference. But let's look at the present setting then. Look over in Exodus chapter 1. And if you remember to get part of it, in Genesis 46:34, the first part of the present circumstances, I think we've got to keep in mind. Now, this might have been 430 years later, or almost. Not quite yet. Were shepherds loathsome to the Egyptians?
Yes.
All right. They still are. And I think it's important to recognize they were then, still are, and I think it's important. We have the same thing that goes on today. I mean, it's amazing. You talk to different ones that at work that raise cattle or whatever, and you mention something about sheep. I haven't heard one of them say one positive thing about sheep. They don't raise them. They don't have them. Where did they get that? I mean, that's just what they've been taught and so on. So shepherds are loathsome, that's one thing. Notice in verse 6 and also in verse 8. In verse 6, Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation. So everyone that was there that had anything to do with it died. Verse 8, now a new king, which would be Pharaoh, would be the title, arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Alright, so you have a new one come on the scene. 430 years later, they don't, or 400 years later, they don't remember anything Joseph did or why this is going on. So you stop and you think about it. What's your plan? I think it's interesting. That's the setting. So we look at it. We need to understand the historical setting. God promised them this was going to happen. All these things are going to take place. They were going to be in a foreign country, possessions. Now they're there. Joseph's rewarded. Now he's gone. New king comes on. And so we see this taking place. Notice the problem that they have then in verse 7. Understanding a proposed solution. Notice in verse 7. The sons of Israel were fruitful, increasing greatly, multiplying, and became extremely mighty. So the land was filled with them. So now they're not just one little location. They're multiplying, multiplying, multiplying. And now what do you think is going to happen if you're an Egyptian? And leadership. I'll give you an example. How many people live in Oklahoma? Approximately 4 million. There's at least 2 million in Egypt already, at least of the Israelites. What would happen if you took 2 million foreigners and put them in Oklahoma right now? If our population went from 4 million to 6 million, with half of them being of one nationality, what would we be doing as Oklahoma? Would there be any alarm? So you stop and you think about it. Now we have so I said, when you understand what's going on, it helps you to understand some of the solutions if you put yourself in that place. For instance, Pearl Harbor took place in our country's history, right? What did FDR do as a result? What's that? We had, from 1942 to 1945, we had 10 concentration camps in the U.S. Are you aware of that? And every Japanese descendant or anything else was put in those camps. Nothing like what they had in Nazi Germany, but they didn't know who they could trust and who they couldn't. How many of us read that in our history books? Okay, but it really helps you to understand history. You understand, for instance, what happens at 9/11. Has anybody gotten suspicious of anybody of that nationality in our country? A friend of mine is from that part of the world. His company dropped in one day 40% of his income. Why? People didn't want to do business with it because they were afraid. It affects, so when you understand and we're looking at settings, put yourself in people's position and you'll greatly understand what's going on. It really helps. For instance, when we talk about Robert E. Lee, where is Arlington Cemetery? Where's that at? Okay, whose property is that?
His property.
Yeah, they took it from him. Made it a cemetery. Now, how'd you like to have your plantation and your home taken from you? You made a cemetery out of it. If you went to walk out your front door, you see a cemetery. He died 5 years later, and eventually the federal government said that was wrong to do, so they gave his ancestors money for it, but not in his lifetime. It's interesting when you look and you start reading history, it keeps you understanding the times with which what's going on. We may not agree with some things, but it helps you to understand. So notice then the first one, then, what are you going to do? If fear Pharaoh. Great increase in all these people. So notice what he proposes. You'll notice then in starting in verse 9 down through 11. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply and invent a war. They also join themselves with those who hate us and fight against us. Depart from the land. Okay? Foreign country comes in to fight us. And who's going to join the foreign country? The Israelites in the middle, they're going to come and join with them and fight against us, and we'll lose, and they are then going to leave the land, and we have all this labor and everything else. Well, we can't have it. What are we going to do? So notice then what he does. He decides to do manual labor. We're going to make them slaves. Notice in 11, so they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labor. They built for Pharaoh storage cities. Now notice those two cities. What were those two cities used for? Those two cities were built by the Jews here. They were military outposts, basically, where all kinds of weapons were stored in case of an invasion or anything else. So they were building these cities for defense and using the Israelites with which to build them. Slave labor. And so this is what they're doing. They have manual labor. But notice what happens in verse 12. The more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, the more they spread out. So they were in dread of the sons of Israel. Well, we're going to really work them hard, and the population is going to go down. We work them really hard, and what? Population increases. Okay, obviously, God is in charge. He isn't. Notice then, okay, so the first plan doesn't work. So notice in verse 13, you have a new plan. The Egyptians compelled the sons of Israel to labor rigorously, and they made their lives bitter with hard labor and mortar and bricks and all kinds of labor in the fields and all labors which they rigorously imposed upon them. They get more severe and make them do more things. Now they're doing everything, working hard, kind, and the dread. So you notice we're going to force them to do these things. And you look at throughout the world in our history, has that ever happened to people around the world? It's happening even now in China. It's happening all over the world. People are spreading out, they're doing whatever. So notice the first solution was manual labor. Second one, increase manual labor. But notice what it does to the Israelites. It says they become bitter. And you and I would do as well. Because of the bitterness, it's not preparing them for what?
Ready to leave.
Preparing them to leave. They're starting to take steps to make them leave. They still aren't ready, and that they're going to have the 10 plagues and so on, but he's still getting them more and more in our own life. How many times has things had to get really bad before you quit a job? Things happen. You wonder, why? God, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why did you take my health? Why did you do that? Because you weren't going to go where God wanted you to go on your own. On occasions. He has to prepare us to do things. So he's preparing. Notice then the next one. Since these two things didn't work, notice the third one, verse 15. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Zipporah and the other Puah, and he said, when you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birthstone, if it's a son, then you shall put him to death. If it's a daughter, then she shall live. Midwives, what are you supposed to do? Kill it. By the way, this would not be, this would be after birth killing too, which we are now supporting even in our own country in different places. So notice then, okay, they didn't work before, now we're going to murder. Isn't that what Herod did in Matthew 1? Anyone under the age of 2, do what? Kill it. Alright, so why would they allow the girls to live? They can marry the Egyptians. Yep. Alrighty, so we are simply trying to wipe them out. We're going to bring this down. Okay, so the midwives, it's interesting what they do, and we'll look at that in a minute. But notice then, when the midwives don't do it, jump over to 22. And what's the next thing? Midwives don't do it. Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast to the Nile, every daughter you are to keep alive. Now it's not just the midwives. Any neighbor, remember they spread throughout all of Egypt. Any neighbor that sees a Hebrew giving birth, if it's a son or a daughter, what are they supposed to do with the sons? Do you wonder how things can happen around the world, and whether it be in Nazi Germany or whatever it might be? Were they turning on their neighbors and everything else? Same thing's happening here. They're turning on people. So, all right, the Hebrews aren't doing it. We're going to have everyone, which, by the way, isn't that not interesting? Because what was Pharaoh's daughter supposed to do when she finds Moses in the basket?
Kill him.
I mean, Dad said to do what? That's an interesting deal. So I want you to stop and think about it when we just look at this part of, will I go to any lengths to get the upper hand? Any of you ever worked where places are that way? You have people over you, anything, I'm going to get the upper hand? Or how do you understand the setting with which you've been raised? It really helps to understand. I think one of the greatest things that's, in any relationship, the more you understand about someone's background, the better you can understand them. I'm not justifying them, but it helps you to understand. The last part of today, so I think the present, the past circumstances help us, the present circumstances. But I want you to think about this understanding submission that you have. You remember, why did the midwives, according to verse 17, not kill?
They feared God.
They feared God. Could Pharaoh have killed them?
Yes. Sure.
So how many of us, if you think about it, what would you and I do? In that situation, would we have basically feared for our own life and obeyed government and done it, or would we be willing to give up our life? The same thing happens with the three in Daniel. I will not bow down. I fear God. Mordecai, same thing. So you stop and you think about it. I think the important thing to remember on submission, we are told to submit, but we have some qualifications. What's the purpose of government? 3 purposes every government has.
Defend our freedom of
Okay, one's protection.
justice.
Okay, one will be protection. One will be for provision. And what's the last one?
The judicial laws to keep.
Okay, so what you have then, and that's where the debates are today too. How much provision should you be giving? How much protection should you be giving? The third one is that a penalty. And we have debates on that as well. When you break the law, this is what should happen. So anytime you go against government, Acts 5:29, I must obey God versus government. When it goes against it. But remember, if I go follow the Lord, government's set up for those 3 things. And if I'm breaking the law, then should I get upset when I get punished for breaking the law?
No.
I think we need to realize when we break the law, following the Lord, we must be willing and understand we could suffer for it. But if you remember, we're told, like wives submit in Ephesians 6, you're told to submit to your children, to submit to your parents. You're told to also submit to authority in Romans. You're told to submit to one another. But there are qualifications. And I think it's important. It also says wives submit to your husbands. It doesn't say wives submit to all men. I think it's important. So remember, when we look at it, submit as long as it's in agreement with what Scripture has to say. But when we go against it, be willing to pay the price. So again, understanding the setting and the history really makes a difference when we look at stuff. And anytime we look at history or anything in the reading, you must realize the time with which they live. When people look back on our time, 100 years from now, how are they going to judge us? No, you stop and think about it. how in the world do they allow this? How in the world do they allow that? Why do, they could do a lot of different things. If you don't believe it, just look at the way you dressed and a lot of things from 34 years ago. It has a lot of impact. So understanding your circumstances, understand Moses' background now when he comes onto the scene will help us.
We'd love for you to come and visit with us and fellowship with us. We're located at 8263 North Owasso Expressway, which is on the east side of Highway 169 North, between 76th and 86th Street North. We have coffee and fellowship from 8:30 to 9 Sundays, followed by Sunday school for all ages from 9 to 9:45, and our Sunday morning worship service is from 10 to 11. We likewise have a Wednesday night service for all ages from 7 to 8. Now may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times, and in every way the Lord be with you all the time.